Welcome to Dr. Sinister's Tales of Terror, where the darkness comes alive and nightmares take hold. Kindly hit the like button and subscribe if you will. Tonight, we bring you 3 bone-chilling late-night horrors that will leave your heart racing and your mind questioning what lurks in the shadows. From sinister forces to unspeakable legends, each tale will grip you with fear and keep you on the edge of your seat. So dim the lights, lock the doors, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. These are stories you'll never forget, but wish you could. Stay tuned if you dare. On a frigid winter night in Casper, Wyoming, the Meadowview Care Facility was quiet, save for the distant hum of medical equipment and the faint creaks of an aging building settling into the cold. Nurse Susan Hardy, a petite, bright-eyed woman in her early 20s, adjusted her scrubs and sighed. It was her 2nd month working the night shift, and she had already grown to dread Room 274. Room 274 belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Banning, a morbidly obese woman in her 60s who was confined to a hover-round medical chair. Her presence was overpowering in every sense of the word. The smell of stale food and unwashed skin hung in the air around her, and her sloppy eating habits made every mealtime a test of Susan's endurance. Tonight, Eleanor was particularly insistent. "Nurse Susan? Nurse Susan?" The woman's raspy voice echoed down the hallway. Susan's stomach tightened as she exchanged a glance with her colleague, Lisa, who was engrossed in charting at the nurse's station. "I'll handle it," Susan said reluctantly, grabbing her flashlight as she headed down the dimly lit hall. Eleanor's door was ajar, and Susan could hear the hum of the hover-round chair even before she stepped inside. Eleanor sat in the center of the room, her small, piggish eyes gleaming with desperation. "I'm hungry," she whined, her thick fingers twitching as if grasping for an imaginary meal. "You didn't give me enough at dinner." Susan forced a smile. "Mrs. Banning, you've had your dinner and 2 extra puddings. It's time to rest now." Eleanor's lips curled into a grotesque pout. "You're cruel," she hissed. "You'll be sorry." Susan stepped back, uneasy but determined to hold firm. "Good night, Mrs. Banning." She left the room, closing the door behind her with a sense of finality. Back at the station, she joined Lisa in silence, trying to shake off the encounter. An hour passed, without incident. The facility seemed calm, almost serene, until the piercing scream of a patient shattered the quiet. Susan and Lisa bolted from the station, following the sound to room 204. Inside, they found a horrifying scene. An elderly man, Mr. Franklin, lay slumped in his bed, his neck torn open and blood pooling beneath him. "Oh my God," Lisa gasped, clutching Susan's arm. Susan's mind raced. "Call the police," she whispered. "Now." Lisa called from her cell phone, while Susan scanned the room for any sign of the attacker. That's when she heard it. The low, unmistakable hum of Eleanor's hover-round chair, somewhere in the distance. "Lisa," Susan called, her voice shaking. "She's out of her room." Together they searched the halls, the hum of the chair taunting them as it echoed through the facility. At times it sounded close, but whenever they turned a corner or opened a door, the hallways were empty. Susan's heart pounded in her chest as the search stretched on, the tension growing unbearable. Finally, they found Eleanor in the kitchen, her hover-round parked near the industrial refrigerator. Her mouth and hands were smeared with blood, and her eyes were wild with a feral hunger. She turned to face them, a grotesque smile spreading across her face. "Hungry," she growled, her voice guttural and unrecognizable. Lisa screamed as Eleanor turned her chair and sped toward her, knocking her to the floor. Eleanor's hands clawed at Lisa, dragging her to the ground in a brutal struggle. Susan grabbed a metal tray and struck Eleanor across the back. The woman howled but didn't stop. Blood sprayed as Eleanor sank her teeth into Lisa's arm. The two nurses struggled with the heavy, violent woman, trying to keep her from sinking her teeth into them. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and moments later the police burst into the facility. It took 4 officers to wrestle Eleanor to the ground and restrain her. She fought with inhuman strength, snarling and snapping at anyone who came near. Finally subdued, she was sedated and taken away in restraints. Lisa, pale and trembling, was rushed to the hospital. Susan sat on the floor of the kitchen, her hands stained with blood and her mind reeling. The quiet of the facility felt oppressive now, the hum of the hover-round chair lingering in her ears like a ghostly memory. The following day, rumors spread among the staff and remaining patients. Some whispered that Eleanor had always been off, that her hunger was more than just gluttony. Others claimed they had seen her roaming the halls late at night, long before her breakout. Susan didn't know what to believe, but she was certain of one thing. She would never forget the sound of that chair, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurked in the most unexpected places. It was a cold, desolate winter night in Watertown, South Dakota. The kind of night where the wind howls through the trees and the frost seems to seep through the walls. The clock on the gas station wall ticked slowly toward midnight, and Vanessa Carter, the lone clerk, counted down the minutes until her shift would finally end. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the empty aisles of motor oil and snacks. Vanessa sighed and looked out the window at the snow piling up in the parking lot. The roads were empty, save for the occasional gust of snow blown across the asphalt. As she turned back to the counter, the door chime jingled, and a blast of icy air announced the arrival of a customer. Vanessa glanced up and froze. The man who stepped inside was unsettling, to say the least. His face was shadowed by a battered cap, and his coat looked stiff and stained. His boots tracked wet, dirty snow across the floor. "Good evening," Vanessa said, forcing a smile. "Can I help you?" The man said nothing. He stood there, staring at her with dark, unreadable eyes. "Sir," she tried again, her voice faltering slightly. "Do you need something?" Still, no response. The man's breath was visible in the chill that followed him inside, but he remained silent. He stood for a moment longer, then turned and walked out, leaving the door to swing shut behind him. Vanessa shivered, not from the cold, but from the nervous knot forming in her stomach. Something about him had unnerved her, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She glanced at the clock. 12:03 a.m. Her shift was over. She hesitated before stepping outside. Peering out the window, she scanned the parking lot for any sign of the man. The coast seemed clear, and she hurried to her car, her breath fogging in the freezing air. The drive home was uneventful, but her nerves were still on edge. Once home, Vanessa locked the door behind her and turned on every light in her small apartment. She fixed herself a cup of coffee and a sandwich, hoping the warm meal would settle her nerves. It was quiet now, just the faint hum of the heater and the ticking of the wall clock. But then she heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a rustling. At first she thought it was her imagination. She shook her head and took another bite of her sandwich. But the sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the bedroom. Vanessa's pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing, maybe just the heater settling or the wind outside. But as she strained to listen, She could swear the sound was coming from the closet. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She crept toward the bedroom, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the shadows. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a soft shuffling like someone shifting their weight. Vanessa's heart pounded as she reached the closet door. Slowly she pulled it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Her flashlight illuminated the floor, and she gasped. There, half hidden beneath her hanging clothes, was a pair of muddy work boots. Her breath hitched, and before she could process what she was seeing, a figure lunged at her from the shadows. It was the man from the gas station. Vanessa screamed as he grabbed her, his icy hands clamping around her wrists. She fought back with everything she had, kicking and twisting, managing to free herself from his grip. She stumbled backward, grabbing a lamp from the nightstand and throwing it at him. The man grunted but kept coming. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she bolted out of the apartment, the icy air biting her skin as she ran barefoot to her neighbor's house. Pounding on the door, she screamed for help. Her elderly neighbor, Mr. Larson, opened the door, startled. Vanessa rushed inside, barely able to explain what had happened. He called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, they found no trace of the man, but they took her report and advised her to change the locks to her apartment. Vanessa moved out the next day. Though the ordeal was over, Vanessa would never feel truly safe, even in her new apartment. On cold winter nights, she would often glance at her closet, shivering at the memory of those muddy boots and the man who had waited in the darkness. It was a quiet night in the small single-story home where Sarah lived with her 2 children, Emily and Jack. The hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house were the only sounds as the family settled in for the night. Emily, 13, was in her room listening to music, while 8-year-old Jack was in his, busy drawing as always. Sarah enjoyed the brief moment of peace, curled up on the couch with a book. The peace was shattered by a blood-curdling scream from Emily's room. Sarah bolted up, her heart pounding, and raced down the hallway. She burst into her daughter's room to find Emily sitting upright in bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "What happened? Are you okay?" Sarah asked, kneeling by her daughter. "There was a man," Emily stammered. "He was in here. He was so tall, and his body was all wrong. His bones were broken. I saw him standing by the closet, Mom." Sarah's brow furrowed as she glanced around the room. The closet door was slightly ajar, and for a moment she felt a chill, but there was nothing there. "Emily, it's just your imagination," Sarah said gently. "You've been watching too many scary videos. There's no one here." Emily shook her head vehemently. "I'm not making it up. He was here, Mom. He was watching me." "Get some sleep, sweetheart," Sarah said, tucking her in. "You're safe, I promise." But as Sarah left the room, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. A few days later, Jack handed Sarah a drawing he had made. She looked at it, expecting his usual cheerful sketches of animals or superheroes, but her stomach dropped. The drawing depicted a tall, gaunt figure with impossibly long limbs and a crooked posture. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its face was a hollow void. The figure was standing outside a house, staring at a window. "Jack," Sarah said, her voice tight. "What is this? Why are you drawing this?" Jack fidgeted nervously. "I've seen him, Mom. He stands in the yard sometimes and looks up at my window." Sarah's skin prickled. "Jack, stop it. Are you trying to scare your sister?" He shook his head quickly. "No, I'm not lying. I saw him last night. He's real, Mom." Sarah sighed and set the drawing aside. Enough. No more of this crooked man nonsense. It's just your imagination playing tricks on you. Jack didn't respond, but the haunted look in his eyes unsettled her. The next day, Sarah found another drawing on the kitchen table. This one was worse. It showed the crooked man standing inside the house in what was unmistakably their living room. His twisted figure loomed over a sleeping family on the couch, a mother and 2 children. Sarah's stomach churned as she stared at the paper. She called the kids into the living room that evening, holding the drawing in her hand. "This has to stop," she said firmly. "I don't know what's going on, but this is getting out of hand. There is no crooked man." "But there is," Emily cried. "He's real, Mom. I saw him." Jack nodded silently, his face pale. Sarah rubbed her temples. "Enough. I don't want to hear another word about him. Now let's just—" The lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and a foul stench filled the air. It was the smell of decay and damp earth. Sarah froze. Her breath caught in her throat. A sound broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like old wood groaning under weight. Then came the snapping, cracking noise of bones bending and breaking. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "He's here." Sarah turned toward the corner of the room. At first she saw nothing, just shadows. But then the shadows moved. The crooked man stepped into the faint light, spilling from a distant window. He was 7 feet tall, his limbs grotesquely long and bent at unnatural angles. His bald head gleamed in the dim light, and ragged strands of stringy hair hung from his scalp. His hollow eyes seemed to pull Sarah in, and his mouth opened wide, revealing jagged, broken teeth. He pointed a gnarled finger at her, his movements jerky and unnatural. His head tilted sharply to one side, as though his neck had been broken. Sarah stumbled back, pulling her children behind her. "Stay away from us!" she screamed, her voice breaking. The crooked man let out a rasping, guttural laugh that sent chills down her spine. He stepped closer, his bony fingers twitching. Emily screamed, clutching her brother. Sarah grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy vase, and hurled it at him. It shattered on the floor, but the crooked man didn't flinch. He seemed to grow taller, his twisted form filling the room as he loomed over them. "Run!" Sarah yelled, shoving the children toward the hallway. They scrambled toward the front door, but the crooked man was suddenly there, blocking their path. His movement was impossibly fast, his body contorting as though he had no bones at all.